Well, welcome to this special edition of the Yahweh blog. We're back into the Rainbow Room, but this time we're going to turn our attention to a different subject. This will be volume 1 of Twistianity, Appalling Twistianity. It is chapter 1 that we're going to begin, and we're going to review the greatest lie ever sold. And that lie is the religion of Christianity. I understand that the turf we're going to enter is the most popular in the history of humankind. There has never been a religion that has appealed to 2.5 billion people, but that's how many Christians there are today. Astounding, really, because as we have throughout the Yada Yahweh series, particularly as we have been doing our programs on the harvest, we've had to delve into the Christian New Testament to debunk their fraudulent takeover of Shabuah as Pentecost. And when we did, what we found is that the Christian New Testament is horrendous. I mean, it's an appalling fraud. Every word in it is laughable. And it is based almost entirely at corrupting and misappropriating the word of God. Every time they cite something to give their myth credit, they pull it out of context where they were in context and properly presented. The passage says exactly the opposite of the point they're trying to make. And they do it over and over again, infinitum, to the point that it just becomes utterly ludicrous. And their testimony isn't even remotely credible. And as we have already presented, the fact is that there is no contemporaneous eyewitness of the man God called Jesus Christ. None. Mark's not an eyewitness. Wasn't written until around 75 CE by a man who wasn't even in Judea at the time. May not even have been alive at the time, all we know, but most certainly wasn't anywhere to be seen. And then Luke, some 80% of Luke is based on a plagiarized version of what Mark had to say. Mark was an agent of Paul, wrote the gospel according to Paul, and Luke was Paul's propagandist. And so Luke is simply Mark times 2. And it was also written around 75 CE under the inspiration of the man who conceived the myth of Jesus and the religion of Christianity with his poison pen in his hideous 14 letters, all of which preceded any one of the 4 Gospels. And if you were to turn, well, that's it for Wookiee today. He has obviously union hours. Wook, you're never going to cut it here, pal. Yahweh expects commitment. It's a dog's life, I guess. But if you recognize that the first 14 books of the Christian New Testament did not include Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, or the book of Acts, they all were based entirely on Paul's letters. And Paul's letters are really pathetic. And they are disgusting. Revoltingly anti-Semitic, filled with logical fallacies, not a single correct citation in them. And Yahweh himself calls Paul the plague of death, calls him out by name 666 years before he wrote his first letter, the one to the Galatians. So there you are. I mean, you really got a mess. And the only 2 that you could remotely say, well, this was written by an eyewitness, it's nonsense. We have no idea who wrote the book of Matthew. And the fact is that 80% of Matthew is copied from either Mark or Luke. And the 20% of Matthew that didn't come from Mark or Luke came from the Abonim, who were actual eyewitnesses that witnessed the Olivet Discourse and the Sermon on the Mount and reported it in Hebrew. And that was included in Matthew's gospel to be the remaining 20%. He didn't see any of it, and he wrote in 95 CE, and we have no idea who wrote any of it. And of course, it's written 6 decades after the fact and plagiarized 3 times over. So that's nothing. And no one has a clue as to who wrote the book attributed to John. And it didn't appear until 95 CE, also 60 years, 3 generations after the fact. So no idea who wrote it. And it provides no biography at all. So you got nothing. I mean, there really is. This is nothing but a myth contrived by Paul and played out by his cronies. And a Christian might say, "Oh, but what about you? What about Josephus? He wrote about him. He said there was a Jesus who was known as the Christ." No, he didn't. And let's just pretend that he had done so. What I'm trying to do here is I've got I'm going to have you see if you can get rid of the artifact we have on the teleprompter. While I'm not using it at this point, we do need to get rid of that artifact. So what you have is the fact that with Josephus, first of all, Josephus was not an eyewitness. Josephus hadn't even been born at the time of the crucifixion. And he was about the most disreputable man in the history of disreputable men. He was nothing but a traitor. His number one story is the story of the last holdouts on Masada. And subsequently, it has been learned that nothing he wrote was true. He made the whole story up. So if the number one story that he presents in the greatest detail is a complete fraud, nothing else he said is remotely credible. Plus, we don't have a copy of Josephus's work that dates to within 8 centuries of this time. And the line that he quotes, he's actually just simply saying that, reporting something that Paul had written because Paul wrote in, and so did Luke, in Rome. And so he would have had copies of it. And he took one line from it, if he wrote it all, and simply reported the one line and then went on. You got nothing. I mean, literally, there's nothing. There isn't. You're claiming that this is the single most important event in human history, that God became a man, which, by the way, is not possible, and that he had this great miraculous life, and not a single eyewitness or contemporaneous account exists. And unlike anybody who actually spoke for Yahweh, he never mentioned Yahweh's name. And unlike anybody that actually spoke for Yahweh, he never wrote anything down, not a word. And he has a name that isn't even a Hebrew name, and yet he's supposed to be a fulfillment of a Hebrew prophecy. And even his title isn't a Hebrew title, and there is no prophecy about a arriving Messiah, and yet they want us to believe that this man fulfilled that prophecy, but the prophecy doesn't exist. He's supposed to be the single most important thing in the history of humanity. Is your man God becomes here to die, who knows for what reason, and he's going to be resurrected. What's the point of that? Because that's going the wrong direction. And yet there isn't a single prophecy that mentions him anywhere in the book that you claim is the one that proves that he was who he was. Not a single reference to a Jesus, not a single reference to a Christ, not a single reference to an Iusu, Isus, Iusun, Christo, Christus, Christun. Not a mention. And 100% of the prophecies that are claimed on behalf of Christians actually are attributed to Dode and mention Dode as the person to whom they belong. And it is Dode that is the Messiah, not the myth. It is Dode that Yahweh calls his son 3 times, not the myth. And it was Dode that predicted exactly when he would arrive to fulfill Pesach and be crucified in the 22nd Mizmor or Psalm, which he wrote in first person about his own experience under his name, not attributing it to a myth. There's no mention of a Christ, a Christian, a Christmas, Easter, a church, a Trinity, a Bible. None of this. Baptism. There's not a word. There's no communion. There's no Last Supper. There's no Good Friday. Nothing. There's no aspect of Christianity that actually appears in the book that Christians claim gives them their authority and credit. And everything that Yahweh, who inspired the books that they want to pilfer, said that he gave us a specific test to apply in Debatim, Deuteronomy 18, as to whether or not he inspired someone who claims to speak for him. And every book in the New Testament fails every single one of those tests, all of them. And on top of that, the theme that Paul came up with, that is his theme for his 14 letters, is, well, God failed. The Torah can't save anyone. He was a complete and utter failure. And because his Torah couldn't save anyone, he turned to me, who I will admit I'm a murderer and a sexual pervert by my own admission, and I'm even demon-possessed, which I'm going to admit to. And he asked me, under those circumstances, to resolve what he couldn't fix and to come up with a gospel of grace that could save people, since his Torah only condemned them. That is the proposition of Christianity, like it or not. And so it is not only absurd that so many people believe such rubbish, and we're going to go into it as we delve into the first of 5 volumes of Twistianity, but that's not the worst part. The worst part isn't pretending that God can be a man. It isn't pretending that God has a new and different name. It isn't erasing God's actual name. It isn't misappropriating all of the promises that God made to his people and applying them to the people who he said don't emulate. It isn't that Paul was demon-possessed and condemned Yahweh and his Torah. Those are all bad things. It isn't just that people believe in a resurrection that never happened or in a person who never lived. All bad things. There's a far worse part of Christianity, and that's why I'm doing this series, because quite frankly, if you're stupid enough to believe Christianity, I've got no use for you. God's got no use for you. I don't really care what you do. You can scream, you can have a fit, you can claim that that I'm a false prophet. I really don't give a hoot. I do not care if you continue to believe it or not. But I care about God's people. I care about Jews. I care about Israel. And what Christians did with that goddamn New Testament and this myth of Jesus Christ is they piled their crap right on top of the truth. And they robbed God's beloved son, David, the actual Messiah and Son of God, who arrived in 33 CE to be crucified in fulfilling Passover, of all of his achievements, of all of his acclaim, of all that he had accomplished on behalf of his people, through identity theft, by promoting a crude counterfeit. And there is nothing more appalling than that. God's got big shoulders. He's put up with Jews for a long time, and that takes a great deal considering how obnoxious they were throughout the Exodus and all the horrible things they said about him and did to him and to Moshe, who led them through the wilderness to the promised land. But when you act so horribly as to rob God's beloved Son of his due. When his beloved Son volunteered to fulfill Pesach, Matzah, and Bikurim for you, enduring crucifixion under Rome to fulfill Passover, going into Sheol to carry our guilt so that it could be deposited, never to be seen again, perfecting us and leading the way into the covenant family on Bikurim. And he volunteers to do that. He does it. He writes all about it so we would have a first-person account of it. And then you not only deny him of that, and your Christian New Testament says that he is not even in heaven. He's dead, buried, and rotting. And you afford all of his credibility and his accolades and his achievements and distinctions, and you give them to a goddamn myth? What do you think God's reaction to that is? Well, he told you 666 years exactly before Paul, who was named Shaul, wrote his first letter to the Galatians, which is abysmal. God called him out by name and said he was the plague of death, and then detailed all that Paul would claim, and to show how obnoxious he was and how foolish someone would have to be to believe him. So I make no apologies as I go into this 5-volume set called Twistianity. The religion is a complete and utter fraud, and I wouldn't care if it wasn't for the fact that the trash is piled right on top of the truth. And because that trash is piled on top of the truth, it is challenging to get God's people, who I do care about, Yisrael and Yehudim, to accept the truth, because it's so hidden and tainted by this horrible lie of the most popular anti-Semitic religion that ever existed. And let's be clear, when Christians say that we share the same God as the Jews, and our Jesus, he was Jewish, and so we have an affinity for Jews, shut up. Here's the fact. The Christian New Testament dehumanizes Jews. It demonizes Jews. It blames Jews for the crucifixion of the goddamn myth of Jesus, as if Jews ruled Judea in the first century, not Rome, and that Jews came up with the torture of crucifixion, not Romans. And you lied many times over, just so that you could dehumanize Jews, so that you could justify stealing all of the promises Yahweh made to them. So don't whine to me about how you have an affinity with Jews. You don't share an Old Testament with them because there is no Old Testament. You don't share a Bible with them because there is no Bible. And what you take and misappropriate from the Torah, the prophets, the Psalms, the writings, you twist, convolute, and misrepresent. So you have no affinity for them, other than one. The saddest of all. Had Paul not been trained as a rabbi, there would have been no New Testament and no Christianity. He had to have this argumentative mindset, this mindset that man was better than God, that man's words are superior to God's words, and the training to know what the Torah and prophets actually said, to be able to manipulate the text, to create the myth of Christianity. And so had the rabbis not trained him, there would be no Christianity. And that means that the 1800 years that the Christian church demonized, dehumanized, subjugated, persecuted, tortured, and killed Jews would never have happened had the rabbis not prepared Paul to perpetrate this horrible crime. But there's even more than that. The fact is that the information, prophetic information that Yahweh and Dod and Yashayah and others of the prophets provide, even Moshe, going all the way back to Moshe, that David is the centerpiece of God's plans. that David was going to live 3 lives, that he had been anointed 3 times, that he was the king of Israel, that he is the Messiah, that he is the Son of God, that he is the chosen one, that he has every accolade that the Christians stole. And that all of it is obvious, it's all named, it's all provided. Even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you can read this. It's all there for you to see, including Dode's own first-person account as a prophecy of him suffering crucifixion. It's all there. And yet the Jews in Judea in the first century turned a blind eye to all of that. And rather than recognize and acknowledge their king for coming to do this for them as he had promised, they did nothing. They denied him. And 100 years later, Rabbi Akiba, the founder of Rabbinic Judaism, one-ups Christianity. He dealt with the growing belief system in this stupid myth of Christianity by foisting another Messiah, Bar Kokhba. He was the Jewish replacement for Dode, just as Iousu Christou was the Greek, Roman, and Pauline replacement for Dode. It's a tragic story. And even though the evidence is obvious, 2,000 years nearly, minus 32, would go by before anyone recognized the obvious. It took 22 years of study for me of building this huge reservoir of knowledge and all the books that I had written and the commentaries that I had composed to finally have enough information that when I went back and retranslated the first 30 Mizmor of Dode, that I finally came to deal with reality, that Dode was right there saying, I'm going to do this. I'm going to be the one who fulfills Pesach, Matzah, and Bokorim. And we read his eyewitness accounts of what he did. We read Yahweh glorifying the Son for what he achieved in the 89th Mizmor, and the first person accounts of Dode's fulfillment in the 22nd and 88th Psalms. And it's right there. Even Yashayah, which Christians robbed to claim that this was the child who was born and the son who was given, was somehow God. No, it addresses Dode, calls him out by name. It's about Dode, every bit of it. He's the son who was given. When Yahweh speaks about Dode being his son and him building a throne for Dode, which he will return and reign forever, and speaking to him by name, Christians misappropriate that and say, oh, that belongs to our guy, even though their guy wasn't mentioned. And Yashayah 53, about the lamb that would be sacrificed, that would bear our burdens. It's about Dode. All of it. And so with that introduction, I want to share Appalling Twistianity. I will also share with you my personal background so that you know. I was born into a racist, anti-Semitic Christian household. My father was an anti-Semite. My mother was a Bible study, prayer warrior Christian. And I grew up in that environment. I even at a very young age, I became the youngest ruling elder in the history of the Presbyterian Church. I gave the keynote address at the National Synod. I led Bible studies. I was an evangelist. Um, I was exceedingly well read. And then gradually I began to think, and thinking is devastating for faith. And if I can think my way out of Christianity, I'm telling you, Yisrael, Yehudim, you can think your way out of Judaism. It's equally corrupt. And I came up with about 20 questions that none of the scholars could answer. No one could answer. I'm going to share some of those questions with you as we go through this first chapter. And I realized that I'm now in a position where, since no one can answer any one of these questions, and at that point, I only knew 1/1000th of what I would come to know about how fraudulent Christianity is. And you will get a feeling for that as we go forward. But no one can answer them. Then I have a choice. I can believe what I now know to be a lie, just because I'm included when I do so, that no one's mad at me when I do so, that I can be in company where everybody else says that they believe too, and they're all trying to impress one another with how they believe. I can be part of that, continue. I can continue to lead Bible studies and just lie to people and myself. That didn't seem very appealing to me. Or I could acknowledge the truth that, yeah, that life is way too complicated for it to be spontaneously generated, and there's just something to those prophecies and the Torah and prophets of Yahweh, that I'm not going to say there's no God, but I'm going to admit that Christianity is a fraud. And I walked away. And that is where God found me, usable, because I had disassociated from Christianity, as you must, whether you are Goy or Jewish. If you do not disassociate from religion or political involvement first, then nothing I can tell you is going to matter. So one of the reasons that we disparage the religious lies is to encourage people to take that same step that I did, and that you must do, that Moshe did, if you're not going to be controlled by the lie. So this is volume 1 of Twistianity. It's appalling. Contradicting God. Chapter 1 is man or myth. This is the biggest lie ever sold. In the 20 centuries, since the letters which would fundamentally change the world were written, very few have had the courage to criticize their author, the self-proclaimed Apostle Paul. And yet, the crimes committed by this man, most responsible for the Christian New Testament and the resulting religion, are obvious, they're egregious, and they're easily proven. In fact, they are irrefutable. The first edition of Questioning Paul, which I wrote in 2009, has become Twistianity. And it conclusively demonstrates that the 13th apostle's oratory and his writings were incompatible with the Word of God. I'm the first in the history of humanity. Well, it's a bit of an exaggeration because Paul only wrote beginning in 52 CE. I'm the first since 52 CE to disprove Paul by comparing Paul to Yahweh. There's other people who have written, maybe 20 some odd, who have gone after Christianity by showing the disconnect between Jesus and Paul. And that's interesting. I'll mention that from time to time, but Jesus never existed. So, if you're comparing a man who did exist and wrote about a myth to the myth that he wrote about, that's probably not the most effective way to demonstrate that it's false. But it's not how I did it. I hold Paul accountable to his own testimony, and I show that his own testimony is incompatible with his own testimony, which is fair game. I show that his statements are irrational, that you cannot go from one thing to another. They're non sequiturs, red herrings. So I use debate parlance to show how Paul contradicted himself or showed himself to be fallacious. But mostly, I condemn Paul by showing how Paul's misappropriations of the Torah and prophets were twisted and misrepresented to create the exact opposite intent that God revealed. And I was in a unique position to do that because I had trained myself to translate the Hebrew text out of the oldest extant manuscripts, including the Dead Sea Scrolls, and have done so consistently for the past 24 years. So I knew Yahweh. I knew what he said. I could go into any passage that Paul had misappropriated. I can go to the oldest manuscript in the Dead Sea Scroll, and I could render it accurately and compare that to Paul's rantings. And I did something else. I actually learned to translate Greek so that I could render Paul's statements as consistently as is possible. And I got copies of the oldest 69 manuscripts of the Christian New Testament. There are 69 manuscripts, codices, that existed prior to Constantine and Eusebius changing everything, just going willy-nilly and adding whatever they saw fit, including the most important line in the Christian New Testament, which you are the Christ, and upon this rock I'm going to build my church. That was written by Eusebius under Constantine's influence in the 4th century. But I had access to the 69 oldest manuscripts, and I learned to translate Greek so I could give you a precise comparison to an amplified and accurate, precisely accurate translation of the Hebrew from the oldest extant sources, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and compare that to what Paul said in the oldest texts of his letters. And just because I didn't want to prejudice the findings by my translations of Greeks, I'm pretty accomplished when it comes to translating Hebrew. My translations of the Hebrew text are better than any that have ever been written. I also provided anywhere from 3 to 5 other existing translations, including the Nestle Aland 27, which is the most well accepted interlinear of a literal rendering of the text. But side by side, they don't do this. They do this. So I compared Paul's rhetoric to the testimony found throughout Yahweh's Torah, Nabiim, Wa Mizmor, guidance, his prophets, his songs. And it became readily apparent that Paul lied throughout when he claimed to speak for God, when he actually contradicted him with every statement. Now, as a consequence, the credibility of the Christian New Testament crumbles. And this is particularly important because there's this misconception in Christianity that Paul was providing guidance and insights and religiosity on what was contained in the Gospels. It's not true. There wasn't any gospel. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not exist when Paul wrote. In fact, the first one and the last one would not even come to exist until 45 years after Paul wrote his first letter. 45 years later. And Paul actually orchestrated both Mark and Luke, or the gospel according to Paul, but written 10 years after Paul's death. So if you really want to know the Christianity that was conceived by Paul, you have to start by putting the books that Paul wrote in chronological order and beginning with Galatians and dealing with what he had to say when he was the only one who had to say it. And then you look at what others added to it or that he inspired to be brought into it. And when you do that, ooh, does it crumble and look incredible. So as a consequence, there's really nothing when you do that. And in fact, there's another aspect of this that I haven't mentioned thus far, which is that if you look at the earliest manuscripts of the codices of the Christian New Testament, and you compare them to either the Textus Receptus or the Nestle Aland 27, which is the most acclaimed scholastic text at this point. There's 184,000 words in the Christian New Testament, and there's 330,000 discrepancies between the oldest texts and the basis of your English translation. 330,000 discrepancies in a text of 184,000 words. So this idea that, I can't believe that God would allow his word to be corrupted. Well, the fact of the matter is all you got is corrupt words. And you're entitled to your beliefs. I don't care what you believe. You're not entitled to your facts. And those are the facts. The conclusions that I've shared with you are irrefutable. There's nothing to prop up the religion built on one man's delusions and his egotistical rants. And since what I'm saying here is evidentially proven, logical, and irrefutable, proven 1,000 times over in Twistianity, literally 1,000 times over. And matter of fact, any one of the 1,000 assaults that I make on the Christian New Testament is sufficient in and of itself to destroy the myth of Christianity. Any one of them. That is the nature. When you're misrepresenting God, you're pretending that you're going to speak for God, you get zero chances to be wrong. If you're claiming that what you are saying was inspired by God, you have zero chances to be wrong. I found 1,000 wrongs. And you get zero. You would have to validate Christianity, invalidate every one of my 1,000 discoveries, including the fact that the text has been maintained so poorly that there's no credible way to have any idea what was actually said to whom and when. And then you have to realize that every word of it is contradictory to what God said. It's hostile to his people, and it robs his beloved son. Now, I understand that the religious and politically correct will flinch at what I've shared with you so far, but that does not change any of the facts in the case. It's because you don't like them, doesn't make them go away. The evidence is overwhelming, which is why Twistianity is now presented in 5 volumes. I didn't want to leave anything out. Now, while I'm telling you that in those nearly 4,000 pages, there are 1,000 validations that Christianity is false and that there never was a Jesus, the fact of the matter is that I could have gone on and written 10 volumes or 15 volumes and added another 2,000 or 3,000 validations that Christianity is invalid. And should you be a Twistian, I've already told you I don't really care if you are or not, and I don't care how a Christian responds. Christianity is not my business. My business is to work on Yahweh's behalf to call his people home. And to do that, I need to reestablish Yahweh's name with Yehudim, and I need to reacquaint Yehudim with the actual Messiah and Son of God who fulfilled Pesach, Matzah, and Bakodim, and therefore was their Savior, David, because he is the returning king. That's what I need to accomplish, and Christianity stands in the way. So that is why I'm doing this. But, should you be upset that I am upsetting your apple cart and I'm telling you that your faith is in a pile of lies, why blame me? Why wouldn't you be grateful? Why wouldn't you say, oh my God, here I and a billion people believe this bridge from man to earth to heaven is valid, and we're going to risk our soul on it, if have the absolute assurity that our souls are going to die because we believe this faulty bridge is going to take us to heaven. And this man has the good sense, he devoted the time to demonstrate that that bridge is completely irrational, totally and from beginning to end false, and all of its engineering and all of its foundations and all of its sinews, everything about that bridge is faulty. Wouldn't you just be the happiest person on earth that I saved you from squandering your soul? Or at the very least say, wow, this is a lot of evidence by a person that's going to sure is confident and is quoting information that's going to be very difficult to refute. But shouldn't I at least invest the time, since my soul is riding on it, to find out whether or not it's true? And when you find out that you can't disprove any one of the 1,000 issues that I have raised, much less all of them, don't you think you'd say, well, thank you for doing that? And oh, by the way, now that you've done that, would you mind sharing with me who God really is, what he is offering, what he's expecting in return? Well, I did that because I wove that right into these volumes of Twistianity. I'm not taking God from you. I'm delivering him to you. Now, these findings cannot be pushed aside by an ad hominem attack on me. Although that is I can tell you most assuredly that is the most common tactic, is to try to threaten me. I'm going to tell you that your wee little threats don't mean diddly squat to me. All I do is look at you and say, what a sorry sack that's the best you got. So that